I'm here as your kind of one of your biggest fans and cheerleaders in terms of the impact that public policy can have on this issue, if I can go forwards. So Brian gave you an overview of the trends and the increase in inequality, and Leslie spoke to you about some of the attitudes to them, and what I found really interesting was that the attitudes actually reflected reality. So when a large number of people said there aren't as many good jobs out there, that's actually what the economic research tells us, that we've had a kind of hollowing out of the middle of the jobs. And so what I want to focus on now is talk about ways to reduce inequality and the ways in which policy can do so. And I think all of us in this room, and you folks in particular, might be very familiar with all the constraints on that. And in fact, you might actually have to remind your politicians or your senior staff of those constraints. And just to kind of run through them and acknowledge them at the beginning, the first is budgetary constraints, right? So we have a period where we have periods of deficit and debt, or constraints on spending at the local level. Debt and deficit issues at the provincial level, and a set of more complex budgetary issues at the federal level. But we do have these constraints on on the ability to actually use public dollars to address this issue. We also have an increasingly kind of interconnected and globalized world, where we have a great deal of mobility of capital and labor, and so that those policy changes can cause concern in terms of what would the impact of those policy changes be on economic activity. And I think we also have an era where we really do have, in some ways, public distrust of governments to solve complex problems. And I think that distrust is another barrier in terms of how can we actually kind of move all the pieces in society and in government that we need to move to actually address these issues. And so the reason I have all these headlines up here is to remind you, as those people that make and implement policy, that one of the first things that we need to actually move policy is to have a kind of public perception of it and have a media perception. And when the media and the public are aware of an issue, as everybody here has been talking about, that is one of the crucial steps or the crucial conditions we need to actually move forward and have more of it, address it more. So I have another graph here with the dreaded Gini coefficient. And so what's good about the Gini coefficient is it's a summary measure. And the thing to remember about the Gini is the higher your Gini coefficient is, the more inequality you have. And so what this is it's the Gini coefficient for the G8 countries and the Nordic countries. And the blue line is market inequality, the market Gini coefficient before the impact of government. And the red line is the post-tax and transfer Gini coefficient, the post-tax and transfer measure of inequality. And the green line is the difference between the two. And there are really two stories that I want this graph to tell you. One of which is policy matters, because that red line is always below the blue line. And so there is, in 2010, there is this success of policy of taxes and transfers and reducing inequality. And the other thing is to draw your attention to the differences in the size of that green line. So what that green line says is there is room for policy change and innovation. And that even in these days of increased interconnectedness and globalization, there is still room for that kind of policy differentiation, so that each country can kind of move to its own interests in that. And we are not all pushed down to the lowest common denominator. So now I'm going to talk a little bit individually about taxes and transfers. So what this graph shows you is on the vertical axis, it shows you the top 1% share of income. And on the horizontal axis, it shows the top marginal tax rate. And so what that downward sloping line says is that the higher your marginal tax rates, top marginal tax rate, there is an association with less income going to the top 1%. So that's, again, you know, if you're looking at addressing inequality, that's a little bit of a hopeful graph. But don't get too hopeful on that graph, because there are a large number of kind of constraints on that. And so what that says is there's a limitation on how much the tax system can directly impact inequality by reducing high incomes. And that has to do with the kinds of issues about how you're more likely to rearrange your affairs for tax avoidance if you're very high income. And that increasing concentration of high income that Brian talked about makes this even more difficult. And the kind of example, who here is from the Ministry of Finance? Anybody here from the Ministry of Finance? Okay. So the easiest way to kind of explain this is to say, if your top $1,000 is at the top tax rate, it's not really worth it for you to rearrange your residency requirements so that much of your income is coming out of Alberta, or to set up a trust, or to set up a corporation. It's not worth that cost for that extra tax that it'll cost you for the top $1,000 that you earn. But if your last $5 million is being taxed at that rate, then it's absolutely worth it. So that is a constraint on increasing in the marginal, of how much you can increase the top rate to kind of reduce that top end inequality. And some recent Canadian research that looked at that experimentation, because a number of provinces have increased the top marginal rate, looks at that experimentation and says there hasn't been that much success. But because my job here is to kind of be the cheerleader for your work, I do want to say that a couple of other pieces of recent research actually also very much tell a different story. And one is a really broad-ranging piece of work by Robin Bodway, who's kind of one of the deans of public finance in Canada, who is saying with a wholesale rearrangement of the tax system, we could actually increase progressivity by kind of rearranging the corporate tax system and how it's integrated into the personal income tax system. That's a kind of long-range kind of a policy objective. In the shorter term, and kind of from a very different perspective, Hugh McKenzie from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has been doing work for a number of years on the employer health tax, and how a couple of changes to the employer health tax both could increase revenues available from it, but could also decrease inequality because of some of the details of how that's arranged. So I'm showing you something kind of similar to what Brian showed you in terms of really the policy poster child, if you're thinking about the impact of transfers, and the poster child of the success of transfers in dealing with one aspect of inequality, which is low income. And so what we see here is old age security in the Canada Pension Plan were a targeted policy intervention that over time had a massive impact on decreasing low income for seniors. And even when we see a little bit of a rise in the latter years, comparing it to where we started at, there's really been a kind of massive impact and massive success that way. But I don't want you to think that we have to kind of go back to those years in the 1960s where everybody was always telling you life was so much better and things were different, and if we could only go back there, everything would be fine. Because really, when we look at poverty rates for lone parents in Ontario, we really see a combination of policy interventions that have had a positive impact. So one of those, some of it is a legal change in terms of how child support payments are determined. There was another one in terms of enforcement of those rights, in terms of how actually we kind of get those child support payments that are determined by the courts into the hands of the lower earning spouse, generally a woman. And then we have a combination of the Canadian Child Tax Benefit and the Ontario Child benefit. And the combination of these policies results in a decrease in poverty rates and a kind of leveling out of those poverty rates during a crisis. So I think it's really important to remember it's not only necessarily one policy, and it's not only transfers that we need to rely on to kind of reduce the low end of the inequality spectrum. So this is the last Gini coefficient I think that anybody's going to make you look at today. And what this looks at is it looks at the impact of public services themselves. So we're not talking about taxes and transfers. And this was an OECD study that looked at 5 public services. It looked at education, healthcare, social housing, childcare, and elder care. And once again, what we see is the blue line is what's called cash income in this study. The red line is the line that includes the value of those public services. And the green line is the difference between the two. And so again, what we see is the value of public services in reducing inequality. And we see again from the green line that there's room for variation in there, and that they can have that impact. So when we think about the role of taxes, we have to think about the role of taxes in 2 ways. The role of taxes, yes, for their redistributive function, if you go back to your kind of Public Finance 101, where they can kind of reduce the incomes of high income earners. And we do see some pretty big constraints, definitely at the provincial level and also at the national level. But there's also a huge role for taxes in terms of redistribution, both through the provision of transfers, because that's how we pay for them, but also the provision of public services and how those public services also reduce inequality. So the last thing that I want to talk to you a little bit about is the role of regulation in reducing inequality. And they have a number of there's a number of benefits to that. The first is there is no cost to government, immediate cost to government when you use regulation in that way. And I know in these times when policies can be a little bit difficult to put forward that have big price tags on them, you really don't want to underestimate regulation. These kinds of regulatory changes can be implemented at all 3 levels of government. So you can look at them provincially through things like the Employment Standards Act and the Labor Relations Act. I don't think for anyone who's reading the newspaper these days, we can't see that federally a big piece of the pie in terms of labor market inequality is the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. And also at the local level through fair wage policies and community benefit agreements, there are places where we can kind of push and pull and have an impact here. And I think it's really important not to solely think about a minimum wage or employment standards as poverty reduction strategies, because we really have to think about these policies as affecting kind of labor market dynamics and bargaining power. So when you raise the minimum wage, what you're doing is you're raising the wage for people who work at that minimum wage, but you are also raising the wages for those people in kind of the bottom half of the income distribution whose wages are related to that, so that you get to kind of have an impact on the labor market in that way. Similarly, when you look at a change in the Labor Relations Act to try and kind of make it easier for those low-income workers to organize, what that does is that has an impact not only on those workers themselves, but it actually has an impact on all of those workers whose wages might be gauged relative to them. So these are really kind of very powerful tools. The other basic thing here, and the McDonald's is the example, is when a larger part of a private company's revenues go toward wages, less of it goes to capital, less of it goes to share prices or retained earnings or to remuneration at the top end. So it's a kind of powerful and subtle tool that can actually have quite a positive impact on inequality. So I guess what I want to leave you with is 2 thoughts, is that currently, despite our concerns, taxes and transfers are having a strong impact on inequality, and that those can have a stronger impact and are still tools for you to be able to use. And to also kind of broaden our thought of kind of what's in our policy levers or what's available to us, that both public services and regulation are two additional powerful policy levers that can be used to address this problem.